In this section, we're going to learn about the 3 layers of the heart wall and the pericardium. So let's begin from the inside and work our way out. Inside, the heart has a thin coating of endocardium. It lines the whole inside. And we're looking at cross-section here, so I'm just doing it in the cross-section. So here it is in the ventricles. Here it is up in the right atrium. And you'll see this in lab when we dissect the heart. But all of that is endocardium. It is just this thin coating. Think of it like the paint on a wall. It's just this thin coating. And it is very smooth. That's the whole point of endocardium, is it's smooth. And this allows blood to easily flow over it. And it is continuous with the lining of the blood vessels. So everywhere your blood's flowing, inside your heart, inside your blood vessels, is this smooth coating. Then next we have myocardium. That's the majority of the heart wall. Think of, like I said, if endocardium is paint, myocardium is the wall itself. Myocardium is the muscle of the heart. And one thing to notice about it, if you compare the right and the left, remember this is right, this is left. It's the heart's right and left, not your right and left. It's much thicker in the left. Notice the thickness of the myocardium here versus here. So it is thickest and therefore strongest, right? Think about what you know about muscles. Strong muscles are bigger in the left ventricle. This is going to help you out in lab when you dissect the heart, because the real heart, when you're dissecting it, it's not going to look perfect like this picture. And the first thing you need to do is figure out right from left. And the way you figure that out is by comparing the thickness of the myocardium. So the place where you find the thick myocardium, you'll know is the left ventricle. You think about the reason for this. The right ventricle, where does it pump blood to? Remember, the right ventricle pumps up through, here's our pulmonary semilunar valve, into the pulmonary trunk, which branches to the pulmonary arteries and goes to the lungs. The lungs are next to the heart. That's it. That's as far as that blood has to get, is the lungs. The left ventricle is going to pump through there. That's the aortic semilunar valve, up to here to the aorta, and then it branches out to the entire body. So all the way to the top of your head, the tips of your fingers, the tips of your toes. That's a lot of work. This is a much harder job. So the left ventricle is stronger so that it can pump blood to the entire body. Then we'll move on to our next layer, is out here on the surface of the heart. And this is epicardium. So it's just like endocardium. Imagine you have a wall that is painted on both sides. And just like endocardium, it is also smooth and shiny. And you'll see this in lab when you dissect the heart. You can see that the inside surface and the outside surface are kind of shiny. That's the endocardium and epicardium. And this is smooth because your heart is beating, it's moving, and this is smooth in order to make it easy so you don't get a lot of friction when the heart beats. So that's the 3 layers of the heart. Now let's talk about the pericardium. Pericardium is the tissue that surrounds the heart. We can divide this up into parts to think about. So we're going to have the visceral layer of serous pericardium. Then we're going to have the pericardial sac. And this is divided into 2 parts. We have the parietal layer of serous pericardium. And then you also have the pericardial, or the fibrous pericardium. Between the visceral serous pericardium and the parietal layer of serous pericardium is the pericardial cavity. Okay, so let me get my words all straight this time. Let's come over here and label these. So notice for the visceral serous pericardium, I used the same color as epicardium. That is because these 2 things are the same. It's 2 different names for the same thing. If you are talking about layers of the heart wall, you call it epicardium. If you are talking about the pericardium, you call it the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. Kind of think about when I'm at school, I'm a teacher. When I'm at home, I'm mom. I'm the same person, but I have 2 different titles depending on where I'm at, what context. So this is the same exact structure, it just has 2 different titles depending on which context you're talking about. Then there is the parietal layer of serous pericardium. That is this part. The 2 layers of serous are one sheet of tissue that is folded in half. If you look up here at the top very closely, we can see here's our visceral, here's our parietal, and see where they meet? It's actually one thing folded in half. Between them is that pericardial cavity. Here's the cavity. It's the space between them. And notice the heart's not in the pericardial cavity. The heart is in the mediastinum. Then the fibrous layer is out here. This is the fibrous layer. And it comes down, it attaches to the diaphragm and it attaches to the arteries. So it's over here, you can see it starts off, it comes down and it attaches to the diaphragm. So one thing to notice is that the heart is not in the pericardial cavity. A lot of people, your first instinct is to think that it is, but it is not. And if you remember in chapter 1, we kind of touched on this in chapter 1, that breakout activity you did, this was one of the questions on there. So if you have a really good memory, you might remember that. The pericardial cavity surrounds the heart, and it is filled with serous fluid. So the serous pericardium, it's a serous membrane. You have 3 serous membranes in your body. If you go back to chapter 1, all the way back to page 15, it shows you this. You have 3 serous membranes. The pericardium around the heart, the pleura around the lungs, and the peritoneum around your abdominal organs. A serous membrane is a sheet of tissue folded in half so that you get 2 layers, and you have a cavity between the 2 layers, and the membrane secretes a fluid that fills that cavity. And the purpose of the fluid is to lubricate. So again, remember, the heart is beating, it's moving. You don't want a lot of friction, so you lubricate that area. And the correct answer of which cavity the heart is in is mediastinum. So this is a specific area within the thoracic cavity that contains the heart. So I have another little video clip that's going to be spliced in here where I have a plastic heart and a sheet of felt cloth, and a paper towel, and I kind of show you this a little better. Hello, I'm going to show you why the heart is not in the pericardial cavity. Let's suppose this is the serous membrane. Serous membrane is a double layer, so we have to take this flat sheet of tissue and fold it in half. Now we have our 2 layers. This then gets wrapped around the heart like this. The inner layer that is touching the heart is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. This outer layer that's not touching the heart is the parietal layer. Between the 2 layers is the pericardial cavity. Notice that the cavity is surrounding the heart. The cavity is this area here between the 2 layers. That cavity wraps around the heart. The heart is not in the cavity. If the heart were in the cavity, it would be like this, but it's not. The heart's here. The only thing in the cavity is serous fluid. Then you have the fibrous layer, so we'll pretend this paper towel is a fibrous layer. It goes on top like this. So your pericardium, you have the fibrous layer, you have your serous, which is folded in half so that you have a parietal layer out here, a visceral layer that's touching the surface of the heart, and the pericardial cavity between those 2 layers of the serous membrane.